give you a little bit of background on myself and what I'm doing. I have been working in post-production for, I don't know, almost 20 years or 20 plus years. In one form or the other. I've also worked in music studios over the years, but I've been basically in Hollywood and working at several of the larger companies in Hollywood, like Sound Deluxe and Warner Brothers and Dane Trax and Sony and Universal and various places over the years. Currently, I primarily am mixing either at Warner Brothers or at Dane Trax, and Dane Trax is actually where I'm at right now, because I'm about to start mixing a temp mix for another movie as soon as we wrap this up, and that's kind of falling in the middle of a schedule of pre-dubbing for yet a different movie. So that's kind of the way a common thing that happens is things all seem to collide together, and we're always juggling the schedules to fit in these different films or games. I basically started more in the editorial side of things and was doing a lot of editorial work and sound design for many years, and would mix things here and there, and eventually just decided I liked mixing, so much that I kind of have shifted to where I probably did, I would say 80 or 90% of sound design and only 10 or 20% mixing probably 10 years ago, whereas now it's like flipped and it's basically the opposite. So I still do sound design, and while I'm doing that, I have kind of a different approach to dealing with the sounds, the plugins that I'm using, the actual sort of methodology in which I am working with the sounds. And so again, just pointing out that really today what I want to talk about is mixing and not so much sound design. Just want to clarify that because, like I said, if I'm doing some sound design work, I might be doing a lot of audio suite type of processing where I'm rendering out stuff and doing various layers of processing on things destructively, which I do very little of when I'm mixing film or game cinematics. Primarily because, two things, I guess. I want to have the flexibility to make adjustments, little tweaks as you add things into the mix. You've got, you might go and mix some dialogue and you kind of tweak some things on the dialogue, and then once you've added in the music and then you've added in backgrounds and sound effects, now the dialogue's not cutting, it sounded nice by itself, but now it needs to cut through a little bit better, or maybe it starts to sound a little bit peaky or something, and so you need to make adjustments to individual elements once you've put all the elements together. And in some cases, you might feel like you've gone too far with something and you want to pull back on it. And so it's nice to have that flexibility, and working in real time versus destructively with audio suite processing allows that flexibility. The other big thing that it allows is, in particular with dialogue, this happens a lot, maybe less with effects, although it certainly also happens with effects, is that I'll be working on a scene in a film and mixing the dialogue, and the dialogue editor hears maybe that there's a little fumbled word, let's say, and the director says, is there anything we can do? Do we have a better take? Is there something else? And so sometimes the dialogue editor will then go off and on another system actually cut together, basically take the same piece of audio that I have and go in there and edit out maybe a couple of words and swap in a couple of words that are maybe from another take, but they're enunciated clearer, for example. And I can then take that piece of audio when they give it to me, bring it into my session, and actually just drop it in underneath all of the automation that I have, and essentially it's done as fast as I can stick it in there. And I don't have to go try to reprocess this new thing to match, you know, what I did before and try to remember what that was. It's basically, you know, just laying on top of it. That being said, sometimes, you know, they're giving you a piece that has different background noise, or it's, you know, from a different enough take that it sounds totally different, and then you have to try to match it in, which is a separate issue. But anyhow, jumping into it, I think the thing I have to point out to start with is monitor levels. I'm going to share the screen here. Oh, you already have it. No, you do not. Okay. So, if you're not already, you should be seeing my Pro Tools screen. Monitor levels. Everybody generally is fairly aware that in the world of film, there is a reference standard of 85 dB, which the room is set up to. That's something that's pretty easy, if you're not familiar with that, to do a search online and find, you know, descriptions of what you need to do to set that up and make that happen. So I won't go into all of that, but there's kind of no debate within the world of film that your reference level is set at 85 and that's the way you mix. You know, the only debate would be sometimes people might mix at a slightly lower volume or something in a small room, because of the way that a small room translates to a large room, but basically it's a non-debated, you know, standard thing. So what I would suggest is if you are working in that arena and are not monitoring at 85, that you really, even if you're editing, even if you're doing sound design, you really need to set that up, understand, you know, on your monitor dial where that sits. You know, most of the time you should be listening at 85 dB so that you know that this is what it's going to sound like, you know, when I hand this off to somebody else. If you're listening at 65 and you're creating a bunch of sound effects that are going to be used in a film, most of the time you're going to create a bunch of stuff that's over compressed and over limited, that just is not going to sound as good in a big room on a big stage, just because it's, you know, mismatched to the proper dynamic range. Now in game cinematics, there's talk of standards, but there aren't really standards in existence yet. I know a number of people who are, you know, very into this topic and trying to establish some standards, and I, for one, will be very happy to see that happen if it eventually does. But it is a complicated situation because the cinematics have to play with the in-game stuff, and the in-game stuff is a much, like I said, much more complicated and sort of bigger issue to wrangle, getting that set up as a standard monitoring level, and, you know, just how that is supposed to translate. There's various issues with that. I mean, if you're watching a movie, you basically sit down in a dedicated space, usually if you're in a theater, or even if you're watching the movie at home, you're sitting down and kind of dedicating 2 hours to watch the movie, and you're generally focused on it. There's not much else going on. And so there's not a lot of external noise. There's not a lot of other things. Whereas if you're playing a game, good chances are, you're going to be playing that for several days at, intervals. And, the overall experience could be, 20 hours. And a lot of the sounds would just be crushing over that kind of a time period. So anyway, that being said, there are some sort of common setups for monitor levels for games. Usually something like 75 or 79. Basically, the way that works is it's like the opposite effect to your dynamics. So the louder your room is, the greater dynamic range you have, because what you're calling, the lower zero VU level, is lower relative to the overall potential height of volume. So so at 75, you actually have 10 dB less headroom than you have at 85, for example. So, but a theater generally is capable of playing back a much more dynamic and big soundtrack than you are going to do on your TV, which is, in part why that difference exists. So anyway, trying to get into a little more specifics about the differences between games and films. Technically they're very different. There's a lot of different considerations. I mean, most of the time in both cases, I'm functioning entirely in 5.1. And in both cases, you're pretty much always creating a stereo or a Dolby encoded LTRT track at the same time. But what I'm primarily focused on is the 5.1 mix. And the LTRT is essentially being created down the line by, a plugin that's actually doing that Dolby encode. So it's something that needs to be looked at and be considered, but it's not a big factor in initially deciding what your mix is about. The other factors to consider in difference between the two is, in film, there's kind of some standard layouts as far as it's going to be 5.1. We know that for sure. The exceptions are so rare that it's not worth bringing up. We know that we're going to have to create stems. We're going to have a dialogue stem, a music stem, an effect stem, a Foley stem, a background stem. In games, I personally kind of create those things anyways normally, but oftentimes they only want an effects stem, not Foley effects and backgrounds, or they don't even require any of that, and they just want the print master, the final mix. And so you don't have to worry about the stems in that case, but generally speaking, you have to create your session and lay out your session to be able to create all of these stems as you go. You don't want to have to do separate passes or have to do separate mixes to output these different stems. It should all basically get recorded at once. So anyhow, dealing with all of that is basically a busing issue. And for me, for the most part, what's happening is I generally am working on 2 or 3, sometimes more, Pro Tools machines that are playback machines. Usually they're HD6 machines, and those all feed into a separate machine that is a recorder and records all of those steps. So if we look at this session that I've got here in front of us, what I have done, and this is kind of my typical workflow, is I will take each section or each category and kind of group it together, and I'll put a VCA master in Pro Tools that's controlling that. And I like to keep those VCAs just after the group of tracks that are feeding into it. And then that way it kind of also within the session creates a clear delineation between the different sections, as you can see here if I scroll through this. So in this top section is all the dialogue. These tracks up here are all feeding the dialogue stem, and those are all primary dialogue tracks. And when I say primary, those are all production. Those are all sounds that were recorded, while the film was shot. And then here we have group tracks. Group is basically specific dialogue that's been recorded in a booth usually, or on a stage, ADR stage, that is scene specific. It's unique to the film generally, and but it's like all the people in the background, it's little extras who look like they should be saying something, it's a little bit of crowd stuff, and that all is still a part of the dialogue because generally that contains English. If it's non-discernible, then we would call that walla and actually generally include that in the backgrounds or in the effects. So anyway, going down through this session, this is the music. And again, I kind of tried to condense this session into something that we could actually look at, because normally this would have taken up 2 or 3 Pro Tools machines. So I just kind of took this little slice out and threw away the tracks that were not applicable to this scene. So then we have our Foley. Foley is all the recorded, again, specifically to the picture. Footsteps, hand pats, rubs, prop handling if somebody goes and picks up a coffee mug and drinks and sets it down, all of that type of stuff. In this case, the effects are very simple because it's not a big effecty scene. So we have some sounds for, looks like for his, some pool in the background and maybe his pen. So anyway, and then we have the backgrounds. The backgrounds are all the ambient tracks that, air, wind, birds, crickets. In this particular case, it's a scene in a bar. So there's, air conditioning sounds that are in there. And then there's bar movement, people creaking their chairs and clinking drinks, and then walla of people talking and stuff, which is all nondescript. So if you were to play that by itself, you won't hear English in it. At least that's the idea. And we do that because once we get to the foreign versions, we can still include that stuff, but we can't include the English. Wherever you can hear English has to be taken out of the movie. And so that's why we separate those things. So my creative approach is very similar, I think, between the two general categories of films versus games, which is, I'm trying to tell a story, and I'm trying to tell a story on kind of a couple of different levels. One is an emotional level, and I would say that's perhaps the most important level. The other, critical level is a cognitive one, where you're telling the actual story of the plot of what's happening. And so that is a little bit more concrete. I just mixed a scene for a different movie where it's partly a Western. It's a movie called Cristiada, and it's about a war, Cristeros War, that takes place in the 1920s in Mexico. And so there's a scene where one of the guys is being attacked by a bunch of federales, and he's inside a house and they're outside shooting in at him. And the scene is a dark in a lot of the places, and he's kind of scrambling around from spot to spot in the house and shooting outside. And at some point, guys come in, and so there's no dialogue going on in that whole scene, but it's still critical to tell the story with the sound effects and with the Foley, that we clearly understand what's happening. It was very confusing when I first started with it. You're hearing all these clunks and clanks and not seeing so much a connection of, okay, he picked up that gun, he's loading that gun, he's shooting that guy, and by clarifying the story with the sound effects, it now makes sense what exactly he's doing in every single beat of what's happening. So that's another big thing, is clarity. Not only that you're understanding clearly what somebody's talking about, but clearly understanding the mix overall, and being able to hear. I want to create not only the clarity but the depth, so that you hear the various layers of the environment and of the surrounding events taking place, but that you're never distracted from the focus of the main thread of the story. So again, if you're doing that for a game versus a movie, it might be a little different approach, but the basic concept is the same. So for me, a big point is dynamics, and that applies to both the dynamics that we obviously usually would associate with that of volume. There needs to be dynamics and volume so that it sounds exciting. But there also needs to be dynamics emotionally. There needs to be dynamics frequency-wise, our frequency spectrum. We need to have high sounds, low sounds, mid sounds, and not get confined to a more mid-range place. And you can pretty much apply the concept of dynamics to any aspect that you're looking at, and the appropriate dynamics are critical to making it work. Getting into a little more specifics here, we'll start looking at this session, and I'll just play you, hopefully you can hear okay. I'll play you a little bit of the scene, and then we'll look at some of the individual parts.
In the Montgomery TV juggernaut Bewitched, the actor playing her husband Darren was notoriously switched in the middle of the series without any explanation. What were the names of the two actors who played Darren? And you gotta get them both.
Damn it, this should be easy.
Oh, you don't know?
I do. Damn, I should. It's the first one is Dick Sargent. The second one is
1 minute left.
Something. Darren was 2 dicks. Yes, 2 dicks play Darren.
Okay, so we need all the dicks we know. All right, so, Dick Van Patten?
No.
Dick Van Dyke?
No.
Dick Clark?
No.
Dick Cavett?
No.
Dick Cheney? Come on. All right, I'm sorry. Any dick.
No.
30
Damn
seconds
it.
left.
Maybe it's not Dick. What about like Johnny Cochran or Courtney Cox? Freddie Dingus, Tommy Two Balls. Schlong Stick. No, wait. It's Dick Wilson. It's Dick Wilson. Okay. He was a major actor in the mid-'60s. He did television, theater, movies, the whole thing. It's gotta be.
Are you sure it's Dick Wilson?
Yes.
Just because he was on Broadway does not mean he was doing Bewitched.
It's Dick Wilson.
That's 20 seconds.
No. It's Dick York.
Dick York.
Yeah, Dick York.
Who the hell is that?
Dick York is the guy. He's the other Darren. I can't believe I didn't think of that.
No, it's Dick Wilson.
Listen. Paul, trust me, okay?
Damn.
It's Dick York.
James, I trust you. You're wrong. Who's the pop culture expert here? Hell, who's the one who started this team, James? I know the answer. It's delicious. No, he's born.
1. Pencils down.
Fine.
Winner.
All right, so there's this little scene. And again, what we've got going on here, look at the individual parts here. The dialogue, what I will typically do is in the production, in this particular scene, there's no ADR, so we're not dealing with that. But in dealing with the production, there's generally a lot of noise. And part of the job of dealing with the dialogue is to deal with that noise and make it so the noise is never distracting, is never, hopefully not even noticeable. So the way that I deal with that is kind of a stack of plugins, each with its own purpose and a specific reason for this order. So the first thing is I'll use something like a Q10 to go in and specifically filter out offending frequencies. There may be things like lights that are buzzing, or camera, or even an air conditioner, which would be a lower frequency thing, but you'll have oftentimes noises that just are really sitting at a certain frequency and becoming a problem there. And so I like to deal with that first in my chain. In terms of, though, jumping ahead, in terms of the process of working, I'll often start with my general EQ first, because my primary consideration is the quality of the actual voice. I want it to sound rich and clear and clean. All this other stuff is basically trying to deal with the noise, and this plugin that I'm using at the end, in this case the R6, is focused on bringing out the good. It's basically my additive EQ, and it's going to be focused on just making the voice quality good, whereas earlier in the chain is going to be the Q10 that is attempting to filter out some of that steady noise. The W43 is one of the two newer noise reduction plugins that Waves has modeled, both of which are great. And personally, I find that using them in this order, with the W43 first, they're not the same. They don't do the same thing. The W43 is not just a little brother, cheaper version or something. It has a different character and a different approach to the sound. There's certainly a lot of similarity to it, but it is a different effect, and I think they work very well in combination with each other. And I think that the W43 allows me, if there's, say, a bunch of air conditioner noise, you can pull down that zone a little bit, and it's kind of allowing you to give a little bit of like a dynamic EQ to these zones of low, low, mid, high, mid as it's set by. That's not something you can change the frequency of, but it's like a gentler thing, whereas the Q10 is very notched, very band specific. Obviously, you do have total flexibility to widen that as you need to, but generally speaking, I'm trying to be as minimal invasion as I can to the sound with the Q10 and just get rid of the noisy problems. So moving on to the WNS, if you're mixing dialogue, that is production dialogue, that is to say, if you're only mixing game cinematics and everything that you're doing is recorded in a studio, then generally the noise issues I'm talking about are not a big problem. There's sometimes a little bit of room noise that's a problem, but generally speaking, that's not a big issue. But if you're dealing with production, I just mixed a game, Need for Speed Shift 2, that all of the, even though it's a game, all of the dialogue is recorded with real actors, or not actors, but real drivers out, for the most part, out where they work, on a racetrack or outside somewhere, in a garage maybe. And so consequently, some of that stuff was very noisy, and some of it was recorded in different spots, and so matching the different parts, it was pretty critical to use WNS on those to shape the sound. So what I will often do here is go in and find the area that is the problem. In some cases, you might need to favor low end, dipping out of more low end. You're setting your threshold to where you're going to trigger that. This is something that you got to be careful with. It can save you, but it can also really create some weirdness that kind of can mess you up later on. And that's another reason why I love to have this on each track and inline in real time, because you can, when you're focused on the dialogue by itself, you may be feeling like, oh my gosh, it's so noisy, I've got to get all this out. And for everything there's a give and take, so there's a negative effect that happens often to that as well, as you're affecting the character of the voice. So once you put that into the mix, you might find that, I can back off on this a little bit. I don't need to dig as hard, and it still sounds good, but now the actual character of the voice is a little bit clearer. And so I also, as you can see here, I'll have exactly the same layout and setup of plugins on all of the dialogue tracks, including the PFX tracks, because I want to be able to copy and paste things, and I want to be able to move things from one track to another as I need to, and have all the automation, everything go with it, and there not be any issues. So it's important to set that up that way in the beginning and then follow it. So then I'll have a de-esser to deal with sibilant stuff. Now all of these things, I come up with a sort of default setting and set that up as I instantiate all the plugins. So that, like in this case, the de-esser is set to a setting that I think is going to work generally well for the whole thing, and it's not going to kill the whole show. So, but when I need to, I can grab it and dig harder. So then a general compressor, again, most of the stuff is compressed enough when I get it, and so it's kind of something that's in line. I mostly need it to raise gain. And sometimes it'll get a little bit shifty back and forth peaks, and I'll need to dive in with some threshold and tweak the thing. But I'll start with, again, a basic setting that's kind of gently addressing things. So moving on down the line, the walla, I don't need all this extra, all the group, I don't need all this extra noise cleanup stuff. It's basically compression and EQ. The compression, is something you need to keep in line. Since these are generally backgroundy voices, you don't want them being real peaky and sticking out. And you also, I'm gonna probably roll them off a little bit more than I am the primary dialogue, because I want those things to sit in the background and not be featured, not poke out too much. The music, quick discussion about that, and we're running out of time here. The music, I love the API stuff that Waves has. I use it all the time on the music. Here's a quick little thing to point out. The difference between score and like a record. This track here at the bottom, that is a record. That is something that came from, in this case, I think it was a uniquely created piece of music for the movie, but it was produced like it was a record, and this is actually our source music. So this is playing through the whole scene, and it's playing in the background like it's coming from a radio in this bar. Whereas this is the score that's playing our tension and playing, the actual scene. And you can see the difference between, the dynamic range of how crushed and this is even not that bad, relatively speaking, the source music is relative to the score. Again, the dynamic range between records versus movies is hugely different. And it becomes very hard when you have music that is, especially rock type music, that is very compressed, like it's been made to be on a CD or on a record, and using that as your score. What happens is it just masks a lot of material, and on the other hand, you can't get the energy out of it that you want. And so you can, it's just more challenging. When you have a dedicated score and I can actually deal with individual elements and stuff's not as compressed and limited, it's much easier to do that. Just the Foley, kind of lump these quickly all together. Foley on through the backgrounds, including the effects. A similar thing, I basically am setting up some form of compression that is set at a very minimal setting for effects. And then something like the Foley, like footsteps, it's generally a little more compressed, because footsteps can end up being very tappy if they're not controlled a little bit. And then EQ wise, here's sort of a starting setting that I'm using, rolling off a little bit more than I would an effect, because I want this to fit. I want it to sound like it's the production. I want you to think that this was recorded on the set, right along with everything else. So anyhow, trying to blast through the end here. Maybe we should jump into some questions. So our first question, do you find there are common problem frequencies in dialogue that you need to globally take out? Yeah, that's a good question. I find personally that I think people set, for the most part, the high pass too high most of the time, and consequently a lot of the voices get thin. I mean, I see that not everybody does that, but I see that a lot. Certainly, you want that low end that's below 60. I don't think there's much doing you any good. So you want to get rid of that. That's just going to add noise. But it's purely, what I find is it's very show specific. It's very much related to the type of the show and the production mixer and how the stuff was recorded, probably the microphones they're using, where they're placing them, the environment that they're in. And so what I'll find is within a given film, there, yes, will be very common frequencies that I'm going for all the time. But that seems like it changes from show to show. And so you kind of have to figure that out each time, and so consequently starting the show takes a little bit longer than once you've kind of figured out those things, and then you kind of know where you're grabbing. That being said, the same general frequency issues that apply to most things do apply, where in the 200s hertz zone, 240 or something, you can get a lot of mud and a lot of buildup there, and so I'm often trying to pull back on that. I'll go on voices into the 110, 120 range and actually raise that a lot of the time, because it's usually been overly filtered out, and then it's kind of not rich enough for me. And up in the upper range, in the 3 to 6K range, you're usually needing to do some sort of a boost, especially for theatrical presentation, because you have X-curve speakers behind the screen issues to compensate for as well. Next question. When mixing sound effects, do you use a lot of EQ, compression, limiting, or do you find that well-cut sound effects generally need to be leveled out? How do you find modern time constraints? Oh, okay, two different questions. Yeah, effects, again, it seems somewhat deliberate or somewhat dependent on the show and the editors. There are people who sometimes deliver stuff that is very close to the pocket where it needs to sit, and you don't need to do a great deal to it, whether that's anything, level, EQ, compression. And then there's times when it's a struggle and you've got to do a lot. So I would say I tend to, whereas on the dialogue I've kind of usually insert all that stuff automatically, on the effects, especially on a bigger show, I may do that more on an as needed basis, because you can really max out some stuff when you're throwing out 180 EQs across every channel. And so although by the end oftentimes you do need EQ everywhere. Compression, again, I personally I'm not I try to see compression as a little bit more of an evil than a good. It's absolutely necessary. It's totally your friend when you need it there. But I think that in film and in most things today, most stuff's overcompressed, and it lacks pop and punch and excitement. And sometimes compression can get you there. Sometimes that's what you need, but most of the time I find that things have been over processed in that regard. So modern time constraints, yes, are definitely time constraints and are very challenging. I'm pre-dubbing a movie right now that's a 3-hour long movie. I've got 8 weeks to do the pre-dubs, and that's all of everything but the music. So it sounds like a lot of time, but it's still a challenge to get everything dealt with in that amount of time. On the flip side, today and tomorrow I'm mixing an entire movie in 2 days to do a temp mix. So time constraints, you have to shift what it is you're doing to fit within the time that you have. Let's see. Do you use any type of EQ or dynamics across the entire mix or submixes? That's a good question. I generally do not do EQ across the entire bus. There's sometimes with a game or something, you find that after you've basically mixed everything, you want to go and insert something that's just going to bump up some 7K or something, a couple of dB, purely because it's now going to become an internet thing or something, and you want it to be clear on small speakers or something to that effect. But generally, no EQ. I will use the low air. Sometimes I use it all the time, but sometimes I'll just leave it right on my effects master output bus, so that anything I'm hitting with the LFE goes through the low air and gets that nice big fat roundness. Sometimes you need some compression or something before or after that to make that work. There's definitely a big issue of needing, as you're summing in the box, needing the headroom to do that. And what most people don't realize, that I've talked to anyway, is that if you've got, say I've got 30 tracks of effects all feeding a 6-track output, you're very easily going to overload that if you have any significant effects going on. And so if you have a master fader associated with that bus and you pull that master fader down, say 6 dB, and put an L360 on there that's making up for that 6 dB, then you're effectively giving yourself an extra 6 dB of headroom. If you do the exact same thing on an aux, it does not work. So it needs to be on a master fader that is associated with that bus, because the master fader on that particular setup, the fader is before the plugins. On an aux and on all audio tracks, the plugins are all after or before the fader, I mean. All right, let's see here. Why do you prefer VCA groups to auxiliary tracks? Well, based on what I just said, what I want to do is I want to control, the sound at its most elementary level from that standpoint. So if I use a VCA, and I lower that VCA 3 dB, I've actually turned down the individual tracks 3 dB. Because it's just basically a group master. Whereas if I were to do that on an aux, I could be slamming the input of that aux and lower the output of that aux, and all I've done is turn down my slammed, overloaded, distorted track. It's still slammed, overloaded, and distorted, it's just a little bit lower. So I want to actually do that before it's being crunched. Let's see. Do you have specific stems that you request from the score producer, or is that something they ultimately decide? Yeah, I always request stems. It's totally dependent on what type of music it is. I would definitely separate things that are are very different frequency and transient wise. Like if you've got drones and pads, that could be a stem. You've got strings, could be a stem. You've got generally your orchestra. You've got drums, percussion. It's nice to have your big percussion with big timpani type drums separated from things that are smaller, lighter type percussion, like blocks or whatever, that you can pan those things differently and get some cool separation, and bass and guitar. So a lot of times people are asking me for a template, and I do have a sort of wet methodology that I work, like we've just kind of looked at, of how I lay out a session kind of no matter what. But I've kind of started with templates, and I kind of gotten away from doing that because it's tends to need to flex too much. It needs to be unique enough to the project to make that work. So hopefully that answers the question. How do you handle verb in film versus game? Actually, I don't really do them different at all. It's basically the same. I will set up in my session. I will set up auxes to feed reverbs, and then I'll have stem specific reverbs that are set up for each stem, and basically when it's the creative part of mixing and actually just making the sound, I don't really view a film versus cinematics differently. So like I said, the main difference there is just sort of the technical limitations between the two. But so I basically, there's obviously specific cases where you're going to do some weird special effect thing and have, maybe some delays that are bouncing around and some weird thing for a dream sequence or something like that. But outside of that, most of the time what I'm trying to do is I'm listening to the production, and I'm looking at the picture and looking at the space and trying to design and create spaces that feel like that real space, and then using auxes just feed to a reverb to achieve that. So we should probably wrap this up, I guess. Maybe the last question: is there something specifically you do to get that fat, bottom-heavy dialogue sound quality I hear in movies? That's mainly a matter of EQ and dynamically controlling that area. Like I said, as I mentioned before, I think a lot of people roll off too much. You have to really focus in on as you're setting the whatever parameter it is. You have to focus in on that parameter and how it's affecting the sound overall, and not worry or not think so much, oh well, it's not messing it up that much, and it's getting rid of all that noise. Again, the noise is more acceptable than you would think to most audiences, whereas having the warmth of that low end and bumping up some of that low end with even just with an EQ is going to bring up some of that low end noise, but most people will not be bothered by the noise so much as missing the warmth out of the voice. So I think that's pretty much it.
So that is all. Thanks again, Tom. Thank you all for attending. Have a great day, and we hope to see you at the next one.